On a cold morning in early February of the year 1014, in the town of Gainsborough in the eastern marches of England, a king lay dying. The room would have been warm despite the season. A fire in the hearth. Tapestries hung against stone walls to trap what heat there was. Outside, the gray Lincolnshire sky pressed low over the River Trent, whose waters had carried this man and his army into the heart of England just 5 months before. The river was still now, sluggish with winter, but the ships that had sailed up it remained moored along its banks, hundreds of them, the largest Viking fleet ever assembled, riding at anchor in a conquered land. The man in the bed was perhaps 50 years old. In an age when most men died younger, this was a considerable span, and his body showed it. His hair had gone gray, though the beard that gave him his name, still forked in the old style, split into 2 points in the fashion of Danish kings. His hands, which had held a sword since childhood, lay still on the blankets. His eyes, which had watched his own father's body burned in defeat, which had seen the walls of London and the coastlines of Norway and the fjords of his homeland, were closing. His name was Sweyn Haraldsson. History would remember him as Sweyn Forkbeard. And in 40 days he had done what no man before him had ever accomplished, and what no man after him would accomplish again. He had conquered England, not raided it, not extracted tribute from it, not seized a province or established a foothold or forced a treaty, conquered it completely. The entire kingdom, from the Scottish border to the English Channel, had submitted to him. The English king had fled. The English nobility had sworn oaths of allegiance. The English church had accepted him as their sovereign. Every shire, every town, every monastery, every fortress had acknowledged his authority. He had achieved in a single campaign season what his predecessors had attempted for 200 years. He had won. And now, 40 days before he could be crowned, 40 days before the formal ceremonies that would make his conquest permanent and legitimate, 40 days before the completion of the most successful military campaign in medieval European history, Sweyn Forkbeard was dying. He would be dead by nightfall. His body would be carried back to Denmark for burial. His army would fracture. His conquest would hang suspended, unfinished, waiting to be inherited by a son who was at that moment 1,000 miles away. And within months the king he had driven into exile would return to reclaim his throne, and everything Sweyn had built would begin to dissolve. This is the story of the most complete military victory in English history, achieved by a man whose name most English speakers have never heard. It is the story of a conquest faster, more total, and less bloody than William the Conqueror's more famous invasion 52 years later, and of how that conquest was erased from memory precisely because of the 40 days that followed it. It is the story of a father who won a kingdom and a son who would have to win it again, and of the strange mechanics of historical fame, which sometimes forgets the winner and remembers only the inheritor. It is also, in its deeper currents, a story about what conquest actually means, about the difference between taking a country and holding it, about the fragility of military achievement when it encounters the most implacable of enemies, which is not another army, but simple biological reality. Sweyn Forkbeard beat every opponent he ever faced, except the one opponent no one beats. But before we can understand how he won England, we must understand the world that produced him. We must understand what England was in the late 10th century, and what Denmark was, and what forces had been grinding against each other across the North Sea for 2 centuries before Sweyn was born. We must understand the long arc of violence and accommodation, of raid and settlement, of war and intermarriage that made his conquest not just possible, but, in retrospect, almost inevitable. And we must understand why the sources that tell us this story are so compromised, so partial, so shaped by the interests of the people who wrote them, that almost everything we think we know about Sweyn Forkbeard comes to us through the pens of his enemies. The problem of sources for this period is severe, and acknowledging it honestly is essential before we proceed. The primary English source for Sweyn's conquest is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a series of annals kept at various monasteries across England. The chronicle is invaluable. It is often our only near-contemporary record of events, but it was written by English monks who had every reason to despise the man who had invaded their country, burned their monasteries, and overturned their world. When the chronicle describes Sweyn, it does so with unconcealed hostility. His victories are minimized, his character is blackened, his death is presented as divine judgment. The secondary English source is a collection of later histories, most notably the works of William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, writing in the 12th century, a full 100 years after the events they describe. These historians had access to sources now lost to us, but they were also working within a political context that shaped what they chose to emphasize. By their time, England had been conquered by the Normans, and there was a complex set of reasons to downplay the earlier Danish conquest and to emphasize instead the uniqueness of William's achievement. The Scandinavian sources present different problems. The Norse sagas that mention Sweyn were composed centuries after his death, often drawing on oral traditions that had been reshaped by generations of retelling. The sagas are magnificent as literature, but as history they require careful handling. They contain genuine information, but it is embedded in layers of legendary accretion, and separating fact from embellishment is often impossible. The one near-contemporary Scandinavian source is the work of Adam of Bremen, a German cleric writing around 1075. Adam interviewed King Sweyn Estridsson of Denmark, who was Sweyn Forkbeard's grandson and who would have had access to family memory and Danish court tradition. This makes Adam's account valuable, but it also means we are receiving Danish royal propaganda filtered through a German ecclesiastical perspective. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: the basic outline of events is not in serious dispute. Sweyn invaded England in 1013. He conquered it with remarkable speed. He died in early 1014 before his coronation. His son Cnut eventually returned to complete the conquest. These facts are attested across multiple sources that had no reason to agree with each other. The interpretations, motivations, and narrative details are where we must be cautious. With that understood, we can return to the story. To understand Sweyn's conquest, we must first understand what he was conquering. England in the late 10th century was not the stable, unified kingdom we might imagine. It was something more fragile, more contested, more haunted by its recent past. The kingdom had been created less than a century before Sweyn's birth. Before that, there had been no England at all, only a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, each with its own royal line, its own traditions, its own laws. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south and west. These kingdoms had warred with each other for centuries, their boundaries shifting with each generation, their alliances forming and dissolving according to the logic of dynastic marriage and military necessity. And then the Vikings had come. The first recorded raid was in 793, when Scandinavian warriors landed on the island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast, and sacked its famous monastery. The attack was small in scale, but enormous in psychological impact. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest sites in English Christianity, the burial place of St. Cuthbert, a center of learning and pilgrimage. Its destruction by pagan raiders from across the sea was interpreted as a sign of God's wrath, a punishment for the sins of the English people. It was also a beginning. Over the following decades, the raids intensified. What had started as isolated attacks by small bands of warriors evolved into larger, more organized campaigns. By the middle of the 9th century, great Viking armies were landing on English shores, not to raid and withdraw, but to conquer and settle. The kingdom of Northumbria fell first, its last king killed in battle in 867. East Anglia followed, its king martyred by the invaders, tied to a tree and shot with arrows until he resembled, in the words of one chronicler, a hedgehog. Mercia collapsed into chaos, its eastern half absorbed into the expanding zone of Viking control. By 878, only Wessex remained. Its king, Alfred, the only English monarch to bear the epithet the Great, had been reduced to hiding in the marshes of Somerset, a fugitive in his own kingdom. The total conquest of what would become England seemed imminent. It did not happen. Alfred rallied, won a crucial battle at Edington, and negotiated a partition of the island. The Vikings retained control of the north and east, a territory that would come to be known as the Danelaw, where Danish law and Danish customs prevailed. Alfred kept Wessex and began the long process of constructing an English identity that could survive and eventually expand. This is the deep context of Sweyn's later invasion. The Viking presence in England was not something alien and external. By the time Sweyn was born, Scandinavians had been living in England for nearly a century. They had intermarried with the local population. They had converted to Christianity. They had become, in many ways, indistinguishable from their English neighbors, except in their personal names and their legal traditions. And, crucially, the descendants of Alfred, his son Edward, his grandson Athelstan, his great-grandsons Edmund and Adred, had spent 3 generations reconquering the Danelaw and unifying the island under a single crown. By 954, the last Viking king of Northumbria had been driven out, and the Kingdom of England, stretching from the Channel to the Scottish border, existed as a political reality for the first time in history. But it was a fragile reality. The old divisions ran deep. The population of the Danelaw still thought of themselves as different from the West Saxons who ruled them. The great northern earls still chafed under the authority of southern kings, and across the North Sea, in the Scandinavian homelands, new generations of warriors were watching, waiting, remembering that their grandfathers had once held half of England and dreaming of taking it back. This was the England that Sweyn Forkbeard set his sights upon. And to understand why he was positioned to do so, we must now cross the water and examine the kingdom that produced him. Denmark in the 10th century was undergoing its own transformation. For most of its history, it had been a loose confederation of chieftains and petty kings, unified less by political structures than by shared language, shared gods, and shared maritime culture. The Danes were not a nation in any modern sense. They were a people, bound by kinship and custom, who happened to occupy the peninsula and islands that controlled access between the Baltic and the North Seas. But by the mid-10th century, something was changing. A dynasty was emerging, the Jelling dynasty, named for the small town in central Jutland, where its founders raised massive runestones to proclaim their achievements. And the founder of this dynasty was a man named Gorm the Old. Gorm was Sweyn's grandfather. The sources tell us little about him, except that he was powerful, that he was pagan, and that he was succeeded by his son Harold Bluetooth. The name survives today as the wireless technology standard, chosen by its Scandinavian inventors as a tribute to a king who had unified disparate Danish factions into a single kingdom. And indeed, that was Harold's great achievement. He consolidated control over the Danish heartland, extended his influence into Norway, and, most significantly, he converted to Christianity. The conversion was political as well as spiritual. By the mid-10th century, Denmark was surrounded by Christian powers. The Holy Roman Empire to the south had been exerting growing pressure on the Scandinavian frontier. Missionary activity had been underway for decades. Harold's acceptance of baptism brought him into the European political mainstream, gave him access to the administrative and cultural resources of the Church, and removed the ideological justification for German aggression against a pagan neighbor. It also created a problem. The old Danish aristocracy was not uniformly enthusiastic about the new religion. For many of them, the gods of their ancestors were bound up with their identity, their privileges, their way of life. The priests who followed conversion brought with them not just new rituals, but new ideas about kingship, about law, about social organization. The church was a centralizing force, and not everyone wanted to be centralized. Into this tension, Sweyn was born. The exact date is uncertain, probably sometime in the 960s. He was Harold Bluetooth's son, apparently his only surviving son, and thus the heir to the nascent Danish kingdom his father had built. What kind of childhood he had, the sources do not say. We know he would have been raised in the martial culture of the Danish aristocracy, learning to fight, to ride, to sail, to command men. He would have been educated in the new Christian faith that his father had adopted. though how deeply that education took is a question the sources answer only ambiguously. Some later traditions suggest Sweyn remained sympathetic to the old gods throughout his life. Others present him as a Christian king who patronized the church in conventional ways. The truth may be that, like many men of his generation, he practiced a pragmatic syncretism, believing in whatever seemed useful at the moment. What we know with more certainty is that his relationship with his father was catastrophic. Around 986 or 987, the date is disputed, Sweyn rose in rebellion against Harold Bluetooth. The sources give various reasons. Adam of Bremen, drawing on Danish tradition, suggests that Harold had been wounded in battle against the Slavs and that Sweyn exploited his father's weakness to seize power. The sagas add more colorful details, including claims that Sweyn was motivated by his father's tyrannical behavior or by disputes over the pace and nature of Christianization. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, characteristically hostile, claims that Sweyn was driven out of Denmark and only later returned to claim his inheritance. The truth is probably simpler and darker than any of these accounts. Succession in early medieval Scandinavia was not automatic. It was a contest. Fathers and sons, brothers and uncles, all had potential claims to royal authority, and those claims were often settled by violence. Sweyn wanted the throne. His father held the throne. Sweyn took it. Harold Bluetooth fled into exile and died shortly thereafter, possibly from wounds received in the fighting. His body was brought back to Denmark for burial, and Sweyn Forkbeard, his only son, became king. He would rule Denmark for the next 27 years, and in that time he would transform not just his own kingdom, but the entire political geography of northwestern Europe. The first decade of Sweyn's reign was consumed by the struggle to consolidate power. The exact sequence of events is impossible to reconstruct with certainty. The sources are too thin, too contradictory, but the broad pattern is clear. Sweyn faced challenges from rivals within Denmark, from enemies abroad, and from the complex political situation he had inherited from his father. Norway was a particular problem. Harold Bluetooth had extended Danish influence over parts of Norway, but that influence was contested by local rulers who had their own ambitions. The result was a long, grinding conflict that drew Sweyn into Norwegian affairs repeatedly over the course of his reign. At various points he was allied with Norwegian factions, at war with them, scheming against them. The details matter less than the pattern. Sweyn was learning how to project power across water, how to build coalitions across national boundaries, how to use naval force as an instrument of political will. And throughout this period, he was also learning about England. The English king during Sweyn's early reign was Ethelred, who would come to be known, though not until after his death, as Ethelred the Unready. The epithet is actually a pun. His name, Ethelred, means noble counsel. Unread, mistranslated as unready, actually means ill-counseled or no counsel. So Ethelred the Unready was really Ethelred the Ill-advised, a king whose very name had been turned into a judgment on his reign. It was not entirely fair. Ethelred came to the throne in 978 under the worst possible circumstances. He was a child, perhaps 12 years old, and he became king because his half-brother, King Edward, had been murdered. The murder was arranged by members of Ethelred's own household, possibly including his mother, in order to place the young Ethelred on the throne. Whether the boy himself was complicit is unknowable. What is certain is that he began his reign tainted by regicide, surrounded by factions who had shown themselves willing to kill for power and lacking the personal authority to control them. The result was a reign marked by chronic instability, by factional conflict within the English aristocracy, by an inability to formulate and execute coherent policy. Ethelred was not stupid. Some of the administrative innovations of his reign suggest genuine intelligence at work. But he was weak, and in 10th century politics, weakness was fatal. And the weakness showed most clearly in his response to the renewed Viking raids. The raids had resumed in 980 after a generation of relative peace. Small fleets at first testing the English defenses, then larger expeditions as it became clear that those defenses were inadequate. By the early 990s, substantial Viking armies were landing on English shores, not just to plunder, but to extort. They would ravage a district until the local authorities agreed to pay them to go away. These payments were called Dangeld, Danish money, and they represented a catastrophic failure of royal authority. A king who could not protect his people, who could only bribe his enemies to leave, was a king whose legitimacy was in question. Sweyn was watching. Perhaps he participated in some of these raids himself. The sources are unclear. What is certain is that he was gathering intelligence about English conditions, assessing English defenses, calculating English weaknesses. And he was also doing something else. He was building a fleet. The ships of the Viking Age were technological marvels, the product of centuries of Scandinavian innovation. Clinker-built, their hulls constructed from overlapping planks. They were light enough to be carried overland, but strong enough to survive Atlantic crossings. They drew little water, allowing them to sail up rivers that would have stopped deeper vessels. They could be rowed or sailed depending on conditions, and they were fast, faster than anything else on the water in their era. By the mid-990s, Sweyn had assembled the largest such fleet ever seen. The exact number of ships is impossible to determine. Medieval chroniclers routinely exaggerated naval forces, but even conservative estimates suggest something on the order of 200 vessels or more. This was not a raiding fleet. This was an invasion force. The first major coordinated attack came in 994. Sweyn joined forces with Olaf Tryggvason, a Norwegian prince with his own ambitions and his own fleet. Together they sailed up the Thames and attacked London. The attack failed, London's defenses held, but the campaign was significant nonetheless. It demonstrated that the Viking forces could operate at a strategic level, coordinating multiple armies for a single objective. And it demonstrated something else, that Sweyn was not interested in mere plunder. He was interested in England. The raid ended with another Danegeld payment, this one enormous, 16,000 pounds of silver, according to the Chronicle. Olaf Tryggvason took his share and departed, eventually to seize the throne of Norway. Sweyn returned to Denmark, richer, but not satisfied. He had seen England up close now. He had seen its wealth, its agricultural richness, its administrative sophistication. He had seen its coastal defenses, which were inadequate. He had seen its internal divisions, which were severe. He had seen its king, who was weak. And he had begun to think about what it would take to keep England, not just raid it. The following years saw a shift in Sweyn's approach. The raids continued, but they became more systematic. Instead of striking and withdrawing, the Viking forces began to establish winter camps on English soil, maintaining a continuous presence that allowed them to wear down local resistance over time. They stopped avoiding battle with English armies and started seeking it out, correctly calculating that they could win direct confrontations more often than not. The most devastating of these campaigns was led not by Sweyn himself, but by his ally Thorkel the Tall, who arrived in England in 1009 with a massive fleet and proceeded to ravage the country for 3 years. Thorkel's army ranged across southern England almost at will. English forces that attempted to resist were defeated or scattered. Towns that refused to pay tribute were burned. The Archbishop of Canterbury was captured and eventually murdered when his ransom was not paid quickly enough, beaten to death with ox bones at a drunken feast, according to the sources, a death that shocked even the Vikings themselves. By 1012, England was exhausted. The treasury had been drained by repeated Danegeld payments. The army had been demoralized by repeated defeats. The nobility was fractured, some lords collaborating openly with the invaders, while others fled or submitted. The church was traumatized by the murder of its highest ecclesiastical official. And through it all, Ethelred remained on his throne, paralyzed, unable to formulate a response to the catastrophe unfolding around him. This was the moment Sweyn had been waiting for. In the summer of 1013, the Danish king assembled his fleet for the final invasion. This time, there would be no raids, no extortion, no Danegeld. This time, Sweyn was coming to claim the crown itself. The fleet that sailed from Denmark in the late summer of 1013 was, by any measure, one of the most formidable military forces of the medieval world. The sources give wildly varying estimates of its size, but even the most conservative figures suggest something extraordinary. Hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, the accumulated military strength of Denmark and its allies, concentrated for a single purpose. They made landfall at Sandwich in Kent on the southeastern coast of England, but they did not stay there. Unlike previous raiders who had targeted the wealthy south, Sweyn immediately sailed north around the coast of East Anglia and up the Humber estuary into the heart of Northumbria. This was the strategic genius of Sweyn's campaign, and it reveals how carefully he had been thinking about the problem of conquest. The south of England was Wessex, the heartland of the English royal house, the region most loyal to Ethelred and most likely to resist. But the north was different. The north was the old Danelaw, where the population still remembered their Scandinavian heritage, where Danish law still influenced local custom, where many of the great families traced their ancestry to Viking settlers. The north, in short, was territory where Sweyn could expect to find collaborators, and that is exactly what he found. The fleet anchored in the Humber. Sweyn and his army disembarked, and almost immediately the Northumbrian aristocracy came to him. The great lords of the north, men who nominally owed allegiance to Ethelred, but who had their own interests, their own grievances, their own calculations about the future, saw which way the wind was blowing. They came to Gainsborough, where Sweyn established his headquarters, and they submitted. They swore oaths, they provided hostages, they acknowledged Sweyn as their king. It happened with stunning speed. Within weeks of his landing, Sweyn controlled everything north of the Humber. No major battles had been fought, no significant resistance had been encountered. The conquest of half of England had been achieved primarily through negotiation. This was not accident. This was the fruit of 20 years of preparation. Sweyn had been cultivating contacts among the Northumbrian nobility for at least a decade. He had been sending agents, making promises, building a network of potential collaborators who would be ready to welcome him when he finally arrived. The invasion of 1013 was not a gamble. It was the execution of a carefully prepared plan. With the north secure, Sweyn turned south. He left his fleet and his son Cnut, now perhaps 18 or 19 years old enough to command but young enough to still be learning, at Gainsborough with the ships and the hostages, and he marched his army overland toward the heart of England. The campaign that followed was more like a triumphal procession than a military operation. Town after town submitted as he approached. The 5 boroughs, the major towns of the eastern Midlands, including Lincoln, Nottingham, and Leicester, opened their gates without resistance. Oxford surrendered. Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, surrendered. Everywhere Sweyn went, the pattern repeated. The local authorities would come out to meet him. They would swear oaths of loyalty. They would provide hostages as guarantees of their good behavior. And Sweyn would accept their submission, confirm them in their positions, and move on. This was conquest by negotiation, and it was possible only because Sweyn understood something that previous raiders had not. The English aristocracy, whatever their nominal loyalty to Ethelred, were practical men. They had estates to protect, families to preserve, positions to maintain. If Sweyn could demonstrate that he was going to win, that resistance was futile and collaboration would be rewarded, then most of them would choose collaboration. They would convince themselves that they were not betraying their king, but merely accepting political reality. They would tell themselves that their first duty was to their people, to their tenants, to their dependents who would suffer if they resisted. They would find reasons to do what they wanted to do anyway, which was survive. The only place that resisted was London. London, in the early 11th century, was already the largest and wealthiest city in England. Its Roman walls still stood, providing formidable defenses. Its position on the Thames made it a commercial hub and a strategic choke point. And within its walls, Ethelred had taken refuge, along with such forces as remained loyal to him and the naval squadron commanded by Thorkel the Tall. Thorkel, the same Viking commander who had ravaged England for 3 years, had switched sides. The murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury had apparently disgusted even him, or perhaps he simply saw better opportunities serving the English king than competing with Sweyn. Whatever his motives, Thorkel and his ships were now defending London against the Danish invasion. Sweyn attacked. The details are unclear, but the assault failed. London's defenses held. Sweyn lost men. Many of his household, according to one source, drowned in the Thames when they attempted to ford the river without using a bridge. It was his only setback of the entire campaign, and it was not decisive. Because Sweyn understood something about siege warfare that many conquerors have failed to grasp. You do not have to take a city if you can take everything around it. London could hold out for now. But London could not function as the capital of a kingdom that no longer existed. London could not command the loyalty of nobles who had already sworn oaths to someone else. London could not feed itself, or resupply itself, or reinforce itself when every road leading to it passed through territory controlled by the enemy. Sweyn left London under siege and continued his campaign of submission. More towns surrendered, more lords swore oaths, and slowly, inevitably, London's isolation became untenable. By December, even London had given up, the city submitted, hostages were handed over, supplies were provided to the Danish army. Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, was now King of England in all but formal title. And Ethelred, the king who had reigned for 35 years, the king who was supposed to protect his people and had failed, the king who had taxed his subjects to pay his enemies, who had executed his own nobles on suspicion of disloyalty, who had ordered the massacre of Danish settlers on English soil in a spasm of impotent rage. Ethelred fled. He went first to the Isle of Wight, off the southern coast, gathering what household he could. Then, as winter closed in and it became clear that no help was coming, he crossed the Channel to Normandy, where his wife's family ruled. Duke Richard II of Normandy received the exiled king and his family with appropriate ceremony. Ethelred's queen, Emma, herself of Norman blood, daughter of Richard's father, had brought her husband to the only place in Europe where he could still hope for protection. It was the lowest point in the history of the English monarchy. A king driven from his own kingdom, dependent on the charity of foreign relatives, watching from across the water while his enemies enjoyed the fruits of everything his dynasty had built. Sweyn, meanwhile, remained in Gainsborough. It was there that he established his court for the winter. It was there that the English magnates came to do homage, to negotiate their positions in the new order, to secure confirmations of their lands and titles. It was there that Sweyn began the work of transforming himself from a conqueror into a king. The work was considerable. Sweyn needed to establish an administrative structure that could govern England. He needed to reward his followers who had supported his campaigns for years and now expected compensation. He needed to placate the church, which had reasons to distrust a king whose religious commitments were uncertain. He needed to manage the transition of power in a way that minimized resistance and maximized collaboration. He needed, in short, to prove that he was not merely a successful Viking raider, but a legitimate sovereign capable of ruling in peace as well as war. And he was running out of time, though he did not know it. The winter of 1013-1014 was Sweyn's moment of triumph. Everything he had worked for, everything he had planned and sacrificed and fought for, had been achieved. Denmark was his, England was his son Cnut was being groomed to inherit both kingdoms. His dynasty was positioned to dominate northern Europe for generations. The coronation was scheduled for early 1014. The exact date is not recorded, but it would have been a grand affair, a formal ceremony in which Sweyn would receive the crown of England, probably at Winchester or perhaps at London, with the great men of the realm in attendance. It would have legitimized his conquest, transformed military occupation into constitutional rule, made him not just a conqueror, but a king in the full sacramental sense that medieval Christianity demanded. He never lived to see it. On February 3rd, 1014, or perhaps February 2nd, the sources vary slightly, Sweyn Forkbeard died at Gainsborough. He had been king of Denmark for 27 years. He had been king of England for 40 days. The cause of death is nowhere recorded. The man was roughly 50 years old, an advanced age for the period, but not extraordinary. Some later traditions speak of a sudden illness, others hint at violence, though there is no contemporary evidence to support this. Adam of Bremen, drawing on Danish sources, simply states that Sweyn met his end without specifying how. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, predictably, attributes his death to divine intervention, claiming that he was struck down by Saint Edmund, the martyred king of East Anglia, whose abbey Sweyn had reportedly threatened to destroy. This is hagiography, not history, but it tells us something about how the English remembered the moment as the providential elimination of a tyrant who had seemed unstoppable. The truth is probably simpler. Sweyn was an old man by the standards of his age. He had spent decades in military campaigns, exposed to the physical hardships of medieval warfare. He had been wounded in battle at least once, possibly multiple times. Bodies wear out. The stress of conquest, followed by the stress of establishing rule, followed by a harsh English winter, may simply have been more than his body could bear. However it happened, the fact remained. Sweyn Forkbeard was dead. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. In Gainsborough, the Danish army faced a succession crisis that would determine the future of northern Europe. In Normandy, Ethelred received news that must have seemed like divine deliverance. In the halls and abbeys of England, men who had just submitted to a Danish conqueror suddenly found themselves calculating whether their oaths of loyalty had died with the man who received them. The Danish position, which had seemed so unassailable just days before, was suddenly precarious. Sweyn had conquered England through a combination of military force, political timing, and personal reputation. The military force remained. The army at Gainsborough was still the most formidable fighting force in the island, but the political timing had shifted catastrophically, and the personal reputation had belonged to a man now being prepared for burial. Sweyn's fleet and army were with him at Gainsborough. So was his son Cnut, probably around 18 years old, who had spent the campaign learning the art of conquest at his father's side. The Danish forces, according to the sources, immediately proclaimed Cnut as their king. This was the obvious move. Cnut was Sweyn's designated heir, present with the army, capable of commanding it. The soldiers who had followed Sweyn's banner had every reason to transfer their allegiance to his son, but Cnut's position was weaker than his father's had been, and everyone involved knew it. Sweyn had been a proven war leader, a man who had fought his way to power and held it for nearly 3 decades. Cnut was an untested teenager. Sweyn had a lifetime of relationships with the magnates and churchmen of Denmark, built through patronage and threat and alliance. Cnut had whatever reflected prestige his father's name could provide, which was considerable but not the same. Most critically, Sweyn had been the conqueror, the man who had brought the English to submission through his own strategy and force. Cnut had merely been present. The English recognized the shift in circumstance. Within days of Sweyn's death, messengers were crossing the channel to Normandy. The men who had so recently sworn loyalty to Sweyn, the earls and bishops and thanes who had calculated that collaboration was safer than resistance, were now calculating again. Their conclusion was unanimous. Ethelred should return. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle preserves what appears to be the substance of the negotiation. The English magnates sent word to their exiled king that they would receive him back, but only on conditions. They were willing to restore him to power, but they wanted assurances. The Chronicle says that the messengers declared that no lord was dearer to them than their natural lord if he would govern them more justly than he did before. This was not quite an unconditional invitation. It was a rebuke wrapped in an offer of restoration. The English ruling class was telling Ethelred that his previous reign had been deficient, that they had submitted to Sweyn in part because of his own failures, and that they expected better behavior going forward. Ethelred's response is revealing. He did not reject the conditions or insist on his unconditional rights as king. He sent his son Edward, the future Edward the Confessor, then a child, back to England as a hostage to his good faith. He promised to be a good lord to his subjects, to redress their grievances, to forgive all that had been done against him during Sweyn's invasion. He would return, he declared, on terms of reconciliation rather than vengeance. This was savvy politics, whatever we might think of Ethelred's character. The king understood that he was being offered a second chance, that he had done nothing to earn except survive. The English were not rallying to him out of love or loyalty. They were rallying to him because they preferred a weak native king to a strong foreign one, and because Cnut's claim to rule was legally and practically fragile. Ethelred's willingness to accept conditions, to promise reform, to send his own son as guarantee of his sincerity, all of this made the restoration possible. The timing suggests rapid negotiation. Sweyn died in early February. By early spring, Ethelred was back in England with an army. The sources describe his return as triumphant, though the triumph was borrowed. English forces that had so recently submitted to Sweyn now took the field against his son. Cnut's position at Gainsborough became untenable. He was a teenage king without a kingdom, an occupying force whose claim to rule had evaporated with his father's last breath. The army that had conquered England under Sweyn's leadership was formidable, but it was not large enough to hold a hostile country without the passive acquiescence of the population. That acquiescence had depended on Sweyn's apparent inevitability, on the sense that resistance was hopeless and collaboration was the only rational course. With Sweyn dead and Ethelred returning with English support, the calculation reversed. Resistance to the Danes now seemed possible, even likely to succeed. The campaign that followed was brief and decisive, though not in the way Cnut would have hoped. Ethelred moved against the Danish positions with what the sources describe as a great army. The English magnates who had submitted to Sweyn now proved their renewed loyalty by taking the field against his heir. Lindsey, the region around Gainsborough that had been first to submit to the Danish conquest, now found itself caught between the returning English king and the Danish force it had so recently welcomed. Cnut made the only decision that made sense under the circumstances. He retreated. The Danish fleet sailed from Gainsborough, abandoning the conquest that had seemed complete just weeks before. Before departing, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Cnut committed an act of calculated brutality. He mutilated the hostages that the English had given to his father. These men, sons and relatives of the magnates who had submitted to Sweyn, had their hands and ears and noses cut off, then were put ashore to make their way back to their families as living proof of Danish anger. This was not random cruelty. It was a message. Cnut was announcing that he intended to return, that the men who had broken their oaths to his father would face consequences, that collaboration with Ethelred would not be forgiven. He was also, in a sense, acknowledging defeat. A conqueror who expected to rule does not mutilate his subjects' relatives. A conqueror who is leaving but plans to come back does exactly this. The mutilated hostages were Cnut's promise of vengeance. The Danish fleet sailed first to Sandwich, then across the Channel to Denmark. Cnut needed to secure his position at home before he could contemplate a return to England. His father's death had created a succession crisis, not just in England, but in the Danish kingdom itself. Sweyn's elder son, Harold, had been left in charge of Denmark during the English campaign. Now, Harold was king of Denmark in his own right, and Cnut was a landless prince with nothing but a fleet, an army, and a claim to a kingdom he had just been driven from. The brothers reached some form of accommodation. The details are obscure, but the result was that Cnut retained his followers and his fleet, apparently with Harold's support, or at least his tolerance. Cnut spent the next year preparing for his return to England, rebuilding his forces, recruiting additional warriors, assembling the resources for another invasion. He was patient, methodical, and utterly determined. His father's unfinished business would become his own. Meanwhile, in England, Ethelred faced the task of reassembling a kingdom that had collapsed beneath him. The restoration was not smooth. The king who had promised reform proved unable to deliver it. The sources describe continuing tensions between Ethelred and his magnates, continuing incompetence in military and administrative affairs, continuing demonstrations of the qualities that had made his reign so disastrous before Sweyn's invasion. Most damaging was Ethelred's treatment of Lindsey. The region that had submitted first to Sweyn was punished for its collaboration. Ethelred's army ravaged Lindsey, destroying property and killing inhabitants, treating the population as traitors rather than as subjects who had faced an impossible choice. This was exactly the kind of vindictive stupidity that had characterized Ethelred's earlier reign. The people of Lindsey had submitted to Sweyn because they had no choice, because their king had failed to protect them, because collaboration was the only path to survival. Now they were being punished for surviving. The lesson was not lost on anyone who observed it. Submission to a conqueror would be followed by suffering, but so would resistance to that conqueror's enemies. The population of England was caught between forces that would brutalize them regardless of their choices. Ethelred's restoration lasted barely 2 years. In the spring of 1015, Cnut returned with a massive fleet. The sources speak of 200 ships, perhaps exaggerated, but clearly a formidable force. The young king who had fled Gainsborough as an untested teenager was now a proven leader, backed by Danish warriors and allied with ambitious men who saw opportunity in English chaos. Among his key supporters was Thorkel the Tall, the same Thorkel who had led the great raiding army of 1012, who had briefly served Ethelred after the massacre of 1012, and who had now returned to the Danish cause. The presence of Thorkel in Cnut's army was itself a commentary on Ethelred's failure. The English king had managed to lose the loyalty of a man who had switched sides to join him. The campaign of 1015-1016 was far harder fought than Sweyn's conquest had been. England was no longer paralyzed by despair and calculation. The population knew that submission to the Danes brought no safety. Resistance was at least worth attempting. More importantly, Ethelred's son Edmund, later called Edmund Ironside, proved to be everything his father was not. A capable military commander, a charismatic leader, a man who could inspire loyalty and coordinate defense. The war that followed was a genuine contest, not the systematic collapse that had delivered England to Sweyn. Battles were fought across the Midlands and the south. Both sides won victories and suffered defeats. Edmund proved Cnut's equal on the battlefield, perhaps his superior. For the first time in a generation, England had a prince who could fight. But the English cause was fatally compromised by the man who still wore the crown. Ethelred died on April 23, 1016 in London, apparently of natural causes. He had been king for 38 years, one of the longest reigns in English history to that point. It had been a reign of almost unrelieved failure. The Viking attacks that had begun in his youth had grown into existential threats under his leadership. The kingdom his father and grandfather had built, the unified England that had been the greatest political achievement of the 10th century, had been broken and humiliated and driven to the edge of destruction. Now he was dead, and his son was left to fight for what remained. Edmund Ironside was immediately proclaimed king by the magnates who supported him. But he was not the only claimant. Cnut commanded a large portion of England and had his own English supporters. Some of the magnates, calculating as always, had already submitted to the Danish prince. Others were uncertain which way to jump. The kingdom was split between two kings, neither of whom controlled enough territory to rule without eliminating the other. What followed was one of the most dramatic military campaigns in English history. Edmund and Cnut fought 5 major battles in 1016, chasing each other across England in a war of movement and attrition that exhausted both armies. Edmund won at least 2 of these engagements, demonstrating that Danish victory was not inevitable, that English resistance could succeed. But he could not win decisively. Each battle weakened his forces without eliminating his enemy. Each victory was followed by a retreat, a regrouping, another confrontation. The decisive engagement came at Sandun in Essex, probably in October of 1016. The battle was hard fought and the outcome long uncertain. But at a critical moment, Edric Streona, the same earl who had betrayed Ethelred to Sweyn, who had switched sides repeatedly throughout the conflict, who was the very embodiment of the self-interested treachery that had doomed the English cause, withdrew his forces from the field. Whether this was premeditated treason or opportunistic cowardice is unclear. The effect was the same. Edmund's army collapsed. The king barely escaped with his life. After Sandun, Edmund had nothing left to fight with. His army was shattered. His supporters were dead or demoralized. He retreated to Wessex, the heartland of his dynasty, and prepared for a last stand that he knew he could not win. Instead, there was negotiation. The two kings met at a place called Deerhurst, or possibly Olney, on an island in the Severn. The exact location matters less than the outcome. Edmund and Cnut agreed to divide England between them. Edmund would rule Wessex, the south, the ancient core of the kingdom, the land where his ancestors had first risen to power. Cnut would rule everything north of the Thames, including London. It was a humiliating compromise for the English king, but it was better than the alternative. Edmund was allowed to live, allowed to rule some portion of his inheritance, allowed to hope that he might eventually reunify the kingdom. He never got the chance. On November 30th, 1016, roughly 6 weeks after the Treaty of Division, Edmund Ironside died. He was about 26 years old. The cause of death is unknown. Later traditions, written when Cnut's dynasty was itself a memory, speak of assassination, a conspirator stabbing the king while he sat at stool, or poison administered by treacherous servants. These stories may be true. They may be inventions designed to provide dramatic explanation for a convenient death. What we know for certain is that Edmund died, suddenly and without warning, at the precise moment when his death most benefited his rival. With Edmund dead, there was no one left to contest Cnut's claim. The Treaty of Division had specified that if either king died, the survivor would inherit the whole kingdom. This clause, which might have seemed like prudent planning when the treaty was signed, now handed everything to the Danish prince. Cnut became king of all England, not through conquest alone, but through the systematic elimination of everyone who might have opposed him. The English magnates accepted the new reality. They had no choice. Edmund was dead. Ethelred was dead. Edmund's young sons were children, incapable of defending themselves or leading resistance. The remaining members of the English royal family were either in exile or in Cnut's power. The Danish king moved quickly to secure his position. Within months he had married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, the mother of princes who might have contested his rule, a woman who apparently calculated that marriage to the conqueror was preferable to exile with her children. It was a coldly pragmatic union that bound the leading candidate for Norman support to the new regime. Cnut also eliminated potential sources of opposition with systematic ruthlessness. Edric Streona, the treacherous earl who had switched sides so many times, was executed in 1017, killed, according to one source, on Cnut's direct orders, with the king remarking that a man who had betrayed his previous lords could not be trusted to remain faithful to his new one. It was a reasonable conclusion. Other English magnates whose loyalty was suspect met similar ends. Edmund Ironside's young sons were sent into exile, eventually reaching Hungary, removed from England and from any immediate possibility of threatening the new dynasty. What emerged from this process was something unprecedented, a Scandinavian empire centered on England. Cnut was king of England from 1016. He became king of Denmark in 1018 after his brother Harold died without heirs. He conquered Norway in the 1020s, driving out the Norwegian king Olaf Haraldsson. At the height of his power, Cnut ruled England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, a domain that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Baltic, from the North Atlantic to the German frontier. This was Sweyn's vision fulfilled, though not by Sweyn himself. The father had conceived the conquest, the son had completed it. The strategy that Sweyn had developed, patient preparation, systematic pressure, the combination of military force and political manipulation, bore fruit in a kingdom that lasted nearly 3 decades. Everything Sweyn had worked for came to pass, just not with Sweyn wearing the crown. The irony cuts deep. Sweyn Forkbeard was arguably the most successful military commander England has ever faced. He conquered the entire kingdom in a single campaign season. He did it without major battles, without massive casualties, without the devastating destruction that usually accompanies conquest. His strategy was so effective that England essentially surrendered rather than fight. No other foreign invader has accomplished what Sweyn accomplished, and yet history has largely forgotten him. The conquest of 1013 is overshadowed by the conquest of 1066. When English-speaking people think of foreign conquerors, they think of William. They think of Norman knights and the Battle of Hastings and the Bayeux Tapestry. They do not think of Danish warships and the Danelaw and the systematic capitulation of English resistance. Part of this forgetting is chronological accident. Sweyn's conquest was completed, but not consolidated before his death. Cnut's reign, which followed, was the actual period of Danish rule. Historians in popular memory naturally focus on the king who ruled rather than the king who conquered. Sweyn won the war. Cnut administered the peace. The administrator gets remembered, the warrior gets forgotten. Part of it is the nature of the sources. The conquest of 1013 was described primarily in English sources written by people who had every reason to minimize what had happened, admitting that their kingdom had simply collapsed, that their king had fled without a fight, that the entire political and military establishment had failed catastrophically. None of this reflected well on the people writing the accounts. It was easier to focus on Cnut's later reign, on the accommodations made and the compromises reached, than on the humiliating surrender that preceded them. The conquest became, in the telling, a kind of prelude rather than the main event, and part of it is the simple fact that Sweyn died too soon. 40 days is not a reign, it is an interregnum. Sweyn never received his coronation, never performed the sacred rituals that would have made him king in the full medieval sense, never had the chance to demonstrate what kind of ruler he might have been in peace. He remains frozen in the historical record as a conqueror, never as a king. The transformation he was planning, from Viking war leader to Christian monarch, was never completed. But to understand what was lost when Sweyn died, to understand the full scope of the transformation that never completed, we need to look more closely at what kind of man he had become in those final months and what kind of kingdom he was preparing to build. The Sweyn who landed in England in the summer of 1013 was not the young Viking who had deposed his father 3 decades earlier. He was approximately 50 years old, which was elderly by the standards of his time. He had been king of Denmark for nearly 30 years. He had survived court intrigues, military defeats, the complex negotiations of Scandinavian power politics, and the transformation of his realm from a pagan backwater to a Christian kingdom integrated into the European political system. He had buried a father, outlived rivals, and raised sons who would carry his ambitions forward. He was, by any measure, one of the most experienced rulers in Northern Europe. The sources give us glimpses of his court in those final weeks. Gainsborough, where he established his headquarters, became a temporary capital, a strange hybrid of military camp and royal residence. Danish jarls and English thegns mingled uneasily. Churchmen who had come to negotiate on behalf of their dioceses found themselves in the same hall as warriors still carrying weapons from the campaign. The business of conquest continued alongside the business of governance. Sweyn was simultaneously receiving submissions, extracting tribute, arranging hostages, and planning the administrative structure of his new kingdom. One detail from the sources stands out. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that Sweyn demanded provisions, food, horses, supplies, from the regions under his control. This was standard practice for any army, but the Chronicle also notes something else, that these demands were systematic, organized, distributed, according to a logic that suggested Sweyn was already thinking in terms of permanent governance rather than temporary occupation. He was not simply feeding his army, he was establishing the infrastructure of royal authority. The winter of 1013 to 1014 was bitter across northern Europe. In Gainsborough, Sweyn and his court waited. They waited for spring, when coronation ceremonies could be properly conducted. They waited for the submissions of the last holdouts, the few regions that had not yet formally acknowledged Danish rule. They waited for news from Normandy, where Ethelred and his family remained in exile, waiting themselves for an opportunity that would never come while Sweyn lived. And then, on February 3, 1014, Sweyn died. The sources disagree on the cause. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle suggests it was sudden, an unexpected death that took even his closest followers by surprise. Later traditions elaborated. One story, which appeared in the 12th century, claimed that Sweyn was killed by the ghost of Saint Edmund, the martyred king of East Anglia, whom the Danes had killed in 869. According to this account, Sweyn had threatened to destroy the monastery at Bury St. Edmunds, and the dead saint appeared to him in a vision, ran him through with a spear, and the king died screaming that Edmund was killing him. This is, of course, hagiographical fiction, a story invented by monks to glorify their patron saint and to suggest divine punishment for Danish aggression. No contemporary source mentions anything like it. The actual cause of Sweyn's death was probably far more mundane: illness, perhaps a stroke, possibly an infection. He was an old man by medieval standards, and he had just completed a grueling military campaign. His body may simply have given out. But the timing. The timing is what transforms this death from historical footnote to historical tragedy. 40 days. He had been King of England for 40 days. Consider what 40 days means in the context of medieval kingship. A coronation was not simply a ceremony. It was a theological and political transformation. The anointing with holy oil, the placing of the crown, the investiture with the symbols of royal authority. These rituals changed a man from a lord to a king, from a secular ruler to God's anointed representative on earth. Without them, Sweyn was technically an occupier, not a king. He held the kingdom by conquest, not by sacred right. This mattered. It mattered for legitimacy, for how his rule would be remembered, for whether his dynasty could maintain their claim after his death. William the Conqueror, after defeating Harold at Hastings, rushed to have himself crowned on Christmas Day, 1066, just over 2 months after landing in England. He understood that the crown mattered more than the victory. Sweyn, whether by choice or circumstance, never received that crown. The question is whether the timing was coincidence or something more. February 3rd was deep winter. Coronation ceremonies required preparation, the gathering of bishops, the arrangement of the liturgy, the physical preparations of the church, and the regalia. It is possible that Sweyn intended to be crowned in the spring when travel was easier and the full pomp of the occasion could be properly arranged. It is also possible that there were negotiations ongoing about the terms of the coronation, which bishops would officiate, what oaths would be required, what concessions to the English church would be extracted. We do not know. The sources do not say. What we do know is that when Sweyn died, his conquest entered a strange limbo. He had won England, but he had not yet fully transformed that victory into permanent rule. The kingdom was conquered but not consolidated. The dynasty was established but not confirmed. Everything hung on what happened next, and what happened next was chaos. The Danish army at Gainsborough immediately proclaimed Cnut king. This was the natural response. The son of a king, already present with the army, already known to the troops, was the obvious successor. But Cnut was young, probably around 18 or 19 years old. He had experience of military command, but none of governance. He had led raids, but never ruled anything. And the circumstances of his elevation were, to put it mildly, uncertain. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Ethelred saw his opportunity. Within weeks of Sweyn's death, messengers were traveling between Normandy and England. The English nobility, who had submitted to Sweyn out of necessity rather than enthusiasm, were reconsidering their position. The Witan, the council of great men who advised English kings, met and made a decision that would shape the next 2 years of English history. They sent for Ethelred. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the terms of this recall with unusual specificity. The English magnates sent word to Normandy that no lord was dearer to them than their natural lord, if he would govern them more justly than he did before. This was not unconditional loyalty. It was a negotiated return with explicit conditions. Ethelred, the king who had fled without fighting, was being offered his throne back, but only if he acknowledged that his previous governance had been inadequate. This is a remarkable moment in English constitutional history. The Witan was essentially telling a king that his authority was conditional, that he had failed in his duties, and that his restoration depended on his promise to do better. It was not quite a contract. The medieval concept of kingship did not really allow for that, but it was something close to it. It was an assertion that even a legitimate king could lose his throne through misrule, and that the political community had the right to set terms for his return. Ethelred, who had few other options, accepted the terms. By spring of 1014, he was back in England. What followed was a bloody, confused 3-year war that would eventually see Sweyn's vision realized, but not in the way Sweyn had planned, and not under Sweyn's rule. The immediate problem facing Cnut was simple. He did not have enough support to hold England against a returning English king backed by the English nobility. His army was large, but not overwhelming. His political base was narrow. The Danelaw supported him, but the South and the Midlands had submitted to Sweyn reluctantly and were happy to change sides when the opportunity arose. Without his father's reputation, without the 30 years of experience that Sweyn brought to any negotiation, Cnut found himself in an increasingly untenable position. By the summer of 1014, Cnut had withdrawn from England. He sailed to Denmark with his fleet and his army, leaving behind hostages he had taken, young English noblemen whose hands and ears and noses he mutilated before departing. It was a brutal parting gesture, an act of spite and rage from a young man who had just lost a kingdom. But Cnut was not finished. He was his father's son, and his father had taught him patience. The years that followed were a study in strategic preparation. Cnut spent 1014 and 1015 in Denmark rebuilding his forces, consolidating his position, and planning his return. He assembled a new army, larger than the force his father had led. He built ships, he recruited warriors from across Scandinavia, and he waited. Meanwhile, in England, Ethelred's restoration was going poorly. The king was ill. Some sources suggest he had been sick for years, possibly with a condition that affected his ability to lead. His son Edmund, called Ironside for his military vigor, was increasingly taking over the actual business of fighting, but Edmund and his father did not trust each other. The court was riven by factions. The nobility, who had demanded better governance as the price of Ethelred's return, were not seeing it. In 1015, Cnut returned. The invasion of 1015-1016 was different from his father's campaign. Where Sweyn had moved systematically, accepting submissions and building political support, Cnut came for war. The battles were bloody. The destruction was widespread. The kingdom that Sweyn had taken almost peacefully was now being fought over with all the violence that medieval warfare could produce. The war culminated in the Battle of Issanden, sometimes called Ashington, in October of 1016. It was one of the largest and most decisive battles ever fought on English soil. Edmund Ironside, leading the English forces, faced Cnut's Danish army in a confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom. The details of the battle are contested. The sources agree that it was a catastrophic English defeat. Most of the English nobility died on the field. The English army was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Edmund escaped, but with so few followers that he could no longer seriously contest Cnut's claim. What happened next was a negotiation. Edmund and Cnut met at Elney Island in the River Severn and agreed to divide the kingdom between them. Cnut would rule the north and the Danelaw. Edmund would rule Wessex and the south. It was a compromise, a recognition that neither man had the power to eliminate the other completely. But the compromise lasted only weeks. On November 30th, 1016, Edmund Ironside died. The cause is unknown. Some sources hint at murder, assassination arranged by Cnut or his allies. Others suggest illness or exhaustion after months of hard campaigning. Whatever the cause, his death left Cnut as the sole ruler of England, and so Sweyn's vision was finally fully realized by his son. The irony is inescapable. Sweyn conquered England without major battles. Cnut had to fight for years and lose thousands of men to achieve what his father had accomplished through strategy and intimidation. Sweyn preserved the kingdom largely intact. Cnut inherited a realm devastated by 3 years of war, with its nobility decimated and its resources exhausted. Sweyn died before he could consolidate his victory. Cnut spent his entire reign consolidating a victory that had cost far more than it should have. This is the paradox at the heart of Sweyn's story. His conquest was too perfect. It was so swift, so complete, so apparently easy that his death could unravel it entirely. A longer campaign, more battles, more time for Cnut to establish his own reputation and relationships with English power brokers. Any of these might have allowed the transition to proceed smoothly. Instead, Sweyn's very efficiency created the conditions for failure. The kingdom that capitulated without a fight was equally willing to change sides when the conqueror died. What Sweyn built was not a dynasty, it was an opportunity. The opportunity was seized, but seized by someone else. Yet to focus only on the immediate aftermath is to miss the larger transformation that Sweyn set in motion. The Danish conquest of England, whether we date it to 1013 or 1016, changed England in ways that persisted long after the Danish dynasty ended. Consider the administrative changes. The Danish kings, Cnut in particular, did not attempt to replace English systems of governance. Instead, they refined them. The tax system that had developed under Ethelred, the Dangeld, originally designed to pay off Viking raiders, became the basis for royal finance under Danish rule. The shire system, the local courts, the network of royal officials who collected taxes and administered justice, all of these survived the conquest and were strengthened by it. Consider the religious changes. Cnut, despite his Viking heritage, was a devoted Christian, ostentatiously so. He made pilgrimages to Rome. He endowed monasteries. He cultivated relationships with churchmen across Europe. His reign was marked by an intensive engagement with Christian culture and learning that laid the groundwork for the religious flourishing of the later Anglo-Saxon period. Consider the cultural changes. The Danish conquest brought England into closer contact with Scandinavian civilization at the precise moment when that civilization was reaching its greatest extent and sophistication. Trade connections expanded, literary and artistic influences flowed in both directions. The English, who had spent decades viewing the Danes as raiders and destroyers, began to see them as neighbors and partners. All of this flowed from Sweyn's decision, sometime in the first decade of the 11th century, to stop raiding England and start conquering it. The tribute payments that his campaigns extracted had made him wealthy. The political chaos his invasions created had made him powerful. But it was the vision of something more, of a Scandinavian empire with England as its foundation, that drove the conquest of 1013. Sweyn never lived to see that vision fully realized, but the vision was his, the ships were his, the army was his, the strategy was his, the relationships with English power brokers, cultivated over years of intermittent warfare and negotiation, were his. The reputation that made English towns and shires submit without fighting, that was built on 30 years of Sweyn's campaigns. Cnut inherited an opportunity that his father had created, and this is perhaps the deepest irony of Sweyn's story. In the end, his greatest achievement was not conquering England. His greatest achievement was raising a son capable of holding what he had conquered, because Cnut was extraordinary. His reign, which lasted from 1016 to 1035, was by any measure one of the most successful in English history. He brought peace to a kingdom that had known nothing but war for a generation. He maintained the North Sea Empire, England, Denmark, Norway, as a coherent political unit for nearly 20 years. He was respected across Europe, welcomed at the papal court, treated as an equal by emperors and kings, and he did it all because his father taught him how. The lessons of Sweyn's reign, patience, strategic calculation, the willingness to accept submissions rather than demanding battles, the understanding that legitimacy mattered more than mere force, these were the lessons Cnut applied throughout his rule. The son surpassed the father, but the son built on foundations the father laid. There is a temptation, when writing about Sweyn, to frame him as a tragic figure, the conqueror who died too soon, the king who never wore his crown. And there is truth in that framing. Sweyn's death was, in some sense, a tragedy. He deserved to see the completion of his work. He deserved the coronation, the anointing, the transformation from conqueror to king. But tragedy is perhaps the wrong word. Sweyn's story is not tragic. It is incomplete. It is a narrative that breaks off in the middle, leaving the audience to imagine what might have followed. Would Sweyn have been as successful a king as Cnut? Would he have maintained the English nobility's grudging acceptance, or would his rule have provoked rebellion? Would the North Sea Empire have formed differently under his leadership, or not at all? We cannot know. The sources do not permit us to know. Sweyn Forkbeard remains frozen in historical amber, caught in the moment of his greatest triumph, 40 days into a reign that never had the chance to develop into anything more. What we can say is this: the conquest of 1013 was the most complete military victory England has ever experienced. A foreign army landed, marched through the kingdom, and received the submission of the entire country in a matter of months. The ruling king fled without giving battle. The political and military establishment capitulated without serious resistance. It was a conquest so total that it seemed almost unreal, too easy, too clean, too complete. And then the conqueror died, and history moved on. The Danes would rule England for another 27 years. Cnut would build an empire. His sons would squander it. The English would return to power under Edward the Confessor, and the whole sequence would be overshadowed by another conquest, another foreign invasion, another transformation of English society. But none of that changes what Sweyn accomplished. None of that diminishes the strategic brilliance of the 1013 campaign. None of that erases the fact that one man with one army conquered one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe in a single campaign season without fighting a single pitched battle. History has handed Sweyn's victory to his son. History has forgotten the father and remembered the child. History has focused on the dynasty rather than the founder. But the ships that landed at Sandwich in the summer of 1013 were Sweyn's ships. The army that marched through England was Sweyn's army. The strategy that brought a kingdom to its knees was Sweyn's strategy. He conquered England. He just didn't live long enough to keep it. The question that remains, the question that hangs over Sweyn's conquest like a fog that never quite lifts, is why it worked so well. Military history is filled with invasions. Most fail. The defender has every advantage: interior lines, knowledge of terrain, established supply networks, the morale that comes from fighting for home. An invader must cross hostile territory, maintain extended supply lines, fight in unfamiliar ground, and somehow convince an entrenched population to accept foreign rule. The mathematics of conquest favor the defender. This is why most invasions end in retreat, defeat, or grinding stalemate. Sweyn broke the mathematics. He landed on a hostile shore, marched through a kingdom that had successfully resisted Danish armies for a generation, and achieved total victory in approximately 4 months. No pitched battle, no siege warfare, no scorched earth campaign, just a methodical progression through England's political geography, gathering submissions like a man collecting debts that had come due. How? The question demands an answer, and the sources provide fragments rather than explanations. But those fragments, assembled carefully, reveal something that looks less like military genius and more like structural inevitability. The sense that England in 1013 was not so much conquered as collapsed, that Sweyn's campaign was less an invasion than a harvest of decisions already made. Start with the Danelaw. The term itself is a later coinage, but the reality it describes was already ancient by Sweyn's time. For nearly 150 years, the northern and eastern portions of England had been home to Scandinavian settlers. These were not recent arrivals, not raiders who had decided to stay, but the descendants of the great settlement of the 9th century, the grandsons and great-grandsons of the men who had carved out kingdoms at York and Lincoln and Leicester. By 1013, they had been English for generations. They farmed English soil, spoke a language that blended Old Norse and Old English, attended English churches, and participated in English legal and political structures. But they remembered where they came from. This is the crucial point that the sources imply but never quite state directly. The Danelaw was not uniformly loyal to the House of Wessex. The population of northern and eastern England had been incorporated into a unified English kingdom by force, first by Aethelstan in the 930s, then maintained by his successors through a combination of administrative competence and military pressure. The Danes of England had accepted West Saxon rule because they had no choice, because the alternative was endless war, because the kings of Wessex were, for the most part, capable rulers who brought stability and prosperity. But acceptance is not affection. Compliance is not loyalty. And when Sweyn Forkbeard, a Danish king, a Scandinavian lord, a man who spoke their ancestral language and worshipped, at least nominally, their ancestral gods before his conversion, when this man landed with an army and demanded submission, the calculus changed. The people of the Danelaw were being asked to choose between 2 kings. One was a distant ruler in Winchester who had spent 20 years extracting tribute to pay off Danish raiders. The other was the man those raiders served, a king who offered not endless payments for temporary peace, but incorporation into a Scandinavian political world that many of them had never entirely left. Put like that, the choice seems almost obvious. This is why Sweyn went to Gainsborough. This is why he began his campaign in Lindsey rather than striking directly at Wessex. He was not merely seeking a safe base of operations, though Gainsborough certainly provided that. He was making a statement announcing that his conquest would begin with the people most likely to welcome it, allowing their submission to create momentum that would carry him south. And it worked. The speed of the Danelaw's submission, Lindsey first, then the 5 boroughs, then the whole north, was not the result of overwhelming military force. It was the result of a population that saw more opportunity in Sweyn's kingship than in Ethelred's. They were not conquered, they were recruited. This interpretation requires caution. The sources are not explicit about the motivations of the Danelaw's population. We have the facts of submission, who submitted, where, in what order, but not the internal deliberations that preceded those submissions. Some of the submission was certainly coerced. Sweyn's army was large and battle-hardened, and the threat of violence was always present. But coercion alone cannot explain the totality of the capitulation. Armies can force surrender, but they cannot force the kind of active cooperation that Sweyn received. The provisions, the horses, the hostages, the willingness to serve as a base for further operations. Something else was operating. Call it identification or recognition, or simply the calculation that a Danish king would serve Danish-descended subjects better than a West Saxon one had. Whatever name we give it, this factor was essential to Sweyn's success. He conquered England not merely because his army was strong, but because a significant portion of England was willing to be conquered. The second structural factor was Ethelred himself. It is difficult, at a distance of 1,000 years, to fully appreciate how thoroughly Ethelred had discredited himself by 1013. The Danegeld payments were only the most visible symptom of a reign that had become synonymous with failure. For more than 20 years, Ethelred had faced Danish raids with a strategy that amounted to paying them to go away and hoping they would not come back. They always came back. The payments grew larger, the raids grew bolder, the kingdom grew poorer and more demoralized with every passing year. But the St. Brice's Day massacre revealed something worse than incompetence. It revealed a king who, when he finally did act decisively, chose to act through treachery and mass murder. The massacre of 1002 did not merely fail to stop Danish raids, it actively provoked them, giving Sweyn Forkbeard personal motivation for vengeance that transformed him from an opportunistic raider into a committed enemy. And everyone knew it. By 1013, the connection between the massacre and Sweyn's relentless campaigns was common knowledge. Ethelred had made the problem worse through his own actions, and now the bill was coming due. The nobility understood this. The calculations that led the earls and thegns of England to submit to Sweyn were not made in a vacuum. They were made by men who had watched their king fail repeatedly, who had paid increasingly heavy taxes to fund increasingly useless tribute, who had seen their own military capacity degraded by years of defensive inaction. When Sweyn offered an alternative, these men had to weigh the risks of resistance against the costs of continued loyalty to a king who had demonstrated, over 2 decades, that he could not protect them. Many chose Sweyn, not because they loved the Danes, not because they welcomed foreign rule, but because the current arrangement had become intolerable. Ethelred had lost the mandate of heaven, not in the Chinese sense of supernatural approval, but in the practical sense that a king who cannot defend his kingdom loses the moral authority to demand obedience. By 1013, Ethelred's moral authority was exhausted. He had nothing left to offer but the same failed strategies that had brought England to this point. This is why Ethelred fled. This is why he did not stand and fight, did not rally the southern shires, did not attempt the kind of desperate defense that had worked for Alfred the Great 2 centuries earlier. Alfred had faced a kingdom on the brink of collapse and rebuilt it through sheer force of will. Ethelred faced a kingdom on the brink of collapse and ran away. The contrast is instructive. Alfred's legend grew from his willingness to fight when all seemed lost. Ethelred's reputation, already damaged beyond repair, was destroyed by his refusal to try. The third structural factor was time. Sweyn Forkbeard was not a young man in 1013. The sources do not give us his exact birth year, but scholarly consensus places his birth around 960, making him approximately 53 years old at the time of the invasion. This was old for the period, old enough that Sweyn must have known his remaining years were limited, old enough that the question of succession would have been constantly on his mind. But Sweyn had been fighting for 40 years. He had been a warrior since his teenage rebellion against his father in the 980s. He had spent decades leading armies, commanding fleets, negotiating with enemies and allies across Scandinavia and beyond. By 1013, he was not merely experienced, he was the most experienced military commander in Northern Europe. There was no tactical situation he had not encountered, no political complexity he had not navigated, no form of warfare he had not practiced. This experience informed every aspect of the 1013 campaign. The decision to begin in Lindsey was not obvious. Another commander might have struck directly at the centers of power in Winchester or London. But Sweyn understood that England was not a single entity to be conquered, but a collection of regions with different histories and loyalties. He understood that victory in the Danelaw would create political momentum that would make victory in Wessex easier. He understood that submissions freely given were more valuable than submissions coerced through violence, because willing subjects require less force to govern than resentful ones. These are not the insights of genius. They are the insights of long experience applied to a specific problem. Sweyn had spent his entire adult life accumulating the knowledge that made 1013 possible. The conquest was the culmination of that accumulation, the moment when everything he had learned came together in a campaign of crystalline strategic clarity. And then there is the factor that the sources refuse to discuss, but that modern scholarship cannot ignore: the legacy of the earlier Danish kings. Sweyn Forkbeard was not the first Dane to rule in England. The great army of the 860s had established Danish kingdoms across the north and east. Guthrum had ruled East Anglia as a baptized Christian king. The Scandinavian dynasty at York had survived until the 950s, maintaining an independent Danish kingdom in the heart of what would become England for the better part of a century. These kingdoms had been conquered, absorbed, integrated, but they had existed. The precedent of Danish rule in England was not a theoretical abstraction, but a living memory, passed down through the generations of the Danelaw, kept alive in local traditions and family histories. Sweyn was not creating something new, he was restoring something old. This framing mattered. For the population of the former Danelaw, Sweyn's conquest was not an unprecedented upheaval, but a return to an earlier political configuration, one that their grandparents and great-grandparents had known, one that connected them to a broader Scandinavian world, one that offered a different future than continued absorption into a West Saxon-dominated England. The Restoration narrative also provided legitimacy. Sweyn was not a random foreign conqueror, but the heir to a tradition of Danish rule in England that predated the House of Wessex's unification of the kingdom. His claim to England was not merely military but historical, grounded in the reality of earlier Danish kingship, supported by the ethnic and cultural connections that still linked the Danelaw to Scandinavia. This is why the sources never describe Sweyn as illegitimate, never frame his conquest as mere usurpation. He had a claim. The claim was complicated, contested, but it was real. This combination of factors, the ethnic composition of the Danelaw, Ethelred's comprehensive failure as king, Sweyn's decades of military experience, the precedent of earlier Danish rule, created conditions that were uniquely favorable to conquest. None of these factors alone would have been sufficient. Together, they produced a situation in which Sweyn's invasion encountered not a unified kingdom prepared to resist, but a fragmented polity ready to realign. Understanding this context changes how we interpret the conquest itself. Sweyn's victory was not merely a matter of superior tactics or overwhelming force. It was the result of a structural moment, a convergence of circumstances that made England temporarily conquerable in a way it had not been before and would not be again. This is not to diminish Sweyn's achievement. He recognized the moment, he prepared for it, he executed his campaign with precision and restraint. Another commander, facing the same favorable circumstances, might have squandered them through arrogance or impatience or unnecessary violence. Sweyn did none of these things. He saw the opportunity clearly and exploited it with the skill of a master strategist. But the opportunity had to exist before it could be exploited. And that opportunity was created not by Sweyn, but by the accumulated failures of Ethelred's reign, the demographic legacy of the 9th century settlement, and the persistent memory of an alternative political tradition that had never entirely died. The conquest of 1013 was, in this sense, overdetermined. It happened because too many factors were pointing in the same direction for any other outcome to be likely. Sweyn was the instrument, but England's fall was caused by England itself, by decades of misgovernment, by ethnic divisions that the House of Wessex had papered over without healing, by the exhaustion of a kingdom that had paid too much and received too little in return. None of this was visible from the deck of Sweyn's ship as it sailed toward Sandwich in the summer of 1013. The King of Denmark saw only the coast of England growing larger on the horizon, only the adventure before him, only the culmination of years of planning and preparation. He could not have known how perfectly the circumstances favored him. He could not have known that the kingdom he was about to invade was already halfway to surrendering. Or perhaps he did know. Perhaps Sweyn's network of contacts and intelligence gatherers had told him exactly what he would find. A kingdom demoralized by failed leadership, a population in the north and east that would welcome Danish rule, an aristocracy looking for a way out of an intolerable situation. Perhaps the conquest was so smooth precisely because Sweyn had done his homework, had gathered information for years, had waited for the moment when all the factors aligned. The sources do not tell us. Sweyn's intelligence apparatus, if he had one, left no records. His strategic planning, his assessment of English vulnerabilities, his calculation of risks and rewards, all of this is lost. We have only the campaign itself, the sequence of submissions, the relentless southward march, and the astonishing final result: a kingdom conquered without a battle. There is one more element that deserves attention, one more factor that contributed to the totality of Sweyn's victory. It is the factor that military historians often discuss last because it makes them uncomfortable, because it suggests that war is not entirely a matter of strategy and tactics and logistics, but also of something harder to quantify. Luck. Sweyn Forkbeard was lucky. He was lucky that Ethelred was incompetent rather than merely mediocre. He was lucky that the English nobility had reached the breaking point rather than merely being discontented. He was lucky that the Danelaw's population still retained enough Scandinavian identity to view Danish rule as acceptable. He was lucky that no natural disaster disrupted his campaign, that no epidemic struck his army, that no storm destroyed his fleet. He was lucky, in short, that nothing went seriously wrong during the 4 months of his invasion. Luck is not a substitute for skill, but skill without luck often comes to nothing, and Sweyn had both in abundance during the summer and autumn of 1013. His campaign benefited from the absence of the random misfortunes that derail so many military enterprises. The weather cooperated. His army stayed healthy. His ships remained intact. The timing of submissions aligned perfectly with his movements. Everything that could go right did go right. This lucky streak extended to the political sphere. The potential resistance leaders, the great earls of Wessex and Mercia, the bishops who might have rallied religious opposition, the local thegns who might have organized guerrilla resistance, all chose submission over resistance. This was partly a response to Sweyn's strategy of restraint, but it was also a matter of contingency. Different men, or the same men in different circumstances, might have chosen to fight. They did not. The universe cooperated with Sweyn's conquest in ways that the universe does not always cooperate with conquerors. And then, the luck ran out. February 3rd, 1014. Gainsborough. The King of Denmark and England, the conqueror of one of Europe's wealthiest kingdoms, dead after 5 weeks of rule. The cause unknown. The consequences immediate and severe. Luck is distributed unevenly across a life. Sweyn received an abundance of it during his invasion and had it withdrawn completely in its aftermath. The timing feels almost theatrical, as if the universe had contracted to give him exactly enough fortune to conquer a kingdom and not 1 day more to enjoy it. This is, of course, not how causation works. Sweyn's death had physical causes: disease, injury, the accumulated stress of decades of warfare, some combination we cannot identify. The timing was coincidental, not cosmic. But the coincidence is so stark, so perfectly positioned at the hinge of his career, that it creates the illusion of narrative design. As if someone had written a story in which the hero achieves his greatest victory and then dies before he can receive his reward. As if the conquest were somehow too complete, too easy, and the universe demanded compensation. The medieval mind would have seen providence in this. The chronicle sources hint, without stating directly, that Sweyn's death was divine punishment, that the man who had sacked churches and oppressed Christians had been cut down at the moment of his triumph by a god who would not allow such a man to enjoy the fruits of his crimes. This interpretation is theologically convenient, but historically useless. It tells us what the monks who wrote the chronicles believed, not what actually happened. What actually happened was simpler and more bitter. A man grew old. His body failed. He died. It happens to everyone eventually. It happened to Sweyn Forkbeard 40 days too early. The news traveled outward from Gainsborough like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. But these ripples moved at the speed of horses and ships, which meant that for hours, perhaps days, the kingdom existed in a state of distributed uncertainty. Different people in different places knowing different things, acting on information that was already obsolete by the time they received it. In Gainsborough itself, the Danish army knew immediately. The fleet anchored in the Trent knew within hours. Cnut, Sweyn's younger son, was present. He had accompanied his father on the invasion, learning the trade of conquest by watching a master practice it. He was perhaps 19 years old, possibly younger. The sources are vague about his exact age, but they agree that he was young, that he had not yet proven himself in independent command, that he was, in the first hours after his father's death, a prince without a kingdom rather than a king. The army's response tells us something important about how medieval military organizations actually functioned. They did not immediately proclaim Cnut king. They did not scatter in confusion. They did not turn on each other in a succession struggle. Instead, they did something more interesting. They waited. They secured their position at Gainsborough. They sent messengers to inform the rest of the Danish forces scattered across England. And they began the delicate political work of determining what would happen next. This restraint was not automatic. Medieval armies, particularly those composed of independent warriors who had joined for plunder and glory rather than regular pay, were notoriously unstable when their leader died. The death of a king or commander often triggered immediate fragmentation, different factions backing different successors, soldiers deciding the enterprise was over and heading home, subject peoples sensing weakness and rising in revolt. All of these possibilities existed in February 1014. None of them happened, at least not immediately. The reason, probably, was that Sweyn had not conquered England alone. He had conquered it at the head of an army that included many of Denmark's most powerful nobles, men who had their own interests in maintaining the conquest. These men had invested months of effort and considerable resources in the invasion. They had no intention of watching that investment evaporate because of one death, however significant. So they held the army together, they maintained discipline, they kept the fleet intact, and they looked to Cnut as the focal point around which the conquest might be preserved. But Cnut faced a problem that his father had never had to confront. Sweyn had been the king of Denmark for nearly 3 decades. His authority rested on a lifetime of accumulated victories, on the personal loyalty of men who had followed him across the North Sea and into battle and back again, on the web of alliances and marriages and obligations that any long-reigning king builds around himself. Cnut had none of this. He was his father's son, which mattered, but he was not his father. The army at Gainsborough would follow him for now, out of inertia and self-interest. But every day that passed without decisive action was a day in which that provisional loyalty might erode. And there was another problem, one that Cnut could not immediately solve. He was not his father's only son. Harold, Cnut's older brother, was in Denmark. He had remained behind when Sweyn sailed for England, either because someone needed to govern the kingdom in the king's absence, or because the two brothers had already begun the quiet competition for their father's legacy that was so common in medieval royal families. The sources do not explain Harold's absence from the invasion, but they are clear about its consequence. When Sweyn died, there were 2 sons, and 2 potential claims, and no clear mechanism for resolving the question of succession. Medieval Scandinavian kingdoms did not practice strict primogeniture, the automatic inheritance of the eldest son that would later become standard in Western Europe. Instead, they operated under a looser system in which any son of a king might have a claim, and the actual succession was determined by a combination of designation by the previous king, acclamation by the nobility, and, when those methods failed, force. Sweyn had not designated a successor, or if he had, the designation had not been made public. Harold was older. Cnut was present with the army in England. Both had claims. Neither had an automatic right. What emerged in the weeks and months following Sweyn's death was a partition. Harold became king of Denmark. Cnut became king of England, or rather, he claimed to be king of England, because the English had other ideas about who their king should be. The partition was probably negotiated rather than fought over, though the sources do not give us details. It was the kind of pragmatic arrangement that royal families often reached when outright conflict would have destroyed the inheritance they were fighting over. Harold got Denmark, which was the ancestral kingdom, the secure base, the territory where their father had ruled for decades. Cnut got England, which was larger, wealthier, and entirely unsecured. It was, depending on how you looked at it, either the better prize or the worse one. England was worth more, but only if you could keep it, and keeping it had just become much harder. Because while the Danish army was holding together at Gainsborough and the succession was being sorted out between the brothers, something else was happening in the south of England, something that would reshape the entire situation. The English were bringing their king back. Ethelred had been in Normandy since Christmas, perhaps earlier. He had fled when it became clear that resistance was futile, taking his family across the Channel to the court of his wife's brother, Duke Richard II. It was not an unreasonable move for a king who had lost his kingdom. Exile was preferable to death, and Normandy was a logical place of refuge for a man whose queen was Norman. But exile carried its own dangers. A king who abandoned his people was a king who had forfeited his claim. Every day that Ethelred spent in Normandy was a day in which his subjects might conclude that he would never return, that they should accept Danish rule as permanent, that loyalty to the House of Wessex was a sentiment they could no longer afford. Sweyn's death changed the calculation. The conqueror was dead. His son was young and untested. The Danish army was strong but isolated in the north, and Ethelred, whatever his many failures, was still the legitimate king, anointed, crowned, a direct descendant of Alfred the Great through an unbroken line of succession. The English nobility had submitted to Sweyn because they had no choice. Now, suddenly, they had a choice again. The sources tell us that a delegation traveled from England to Normandy to negotiate Ethelred's return. This was not an unconditional invitation. The English had learned something from the disaster of the previous years, and what they had learned was that their king's failures had consequences. The delegation carried conditions. Ethelred could return, but only if he promised to govern better than he had before, to address the grievances that had driven his subjects into Danish arms, to rule with the council of his nobles rather than in isolation, to be, in short, a different kind of king than he had been. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle preserves the terms, or a summary of them. They are remarkable for what they reveal about the relationship between an early medieval king and his people. The king, the Chronicle says, promised that he would be a gracious lord to them, and would remedy all the things which they all abominated, and that everything should be forgiven which had been either done or said against him, on condition that they all unanimously, without treachery, should turn to him. This was, in effect, a contract. The English were offering to restore their king in exchange for his promise to reform. It was not a constitution, not a permanent limitation on royal power, not a precedent that would bind future generations. But it was a recognition, explicit and recorded, that a king's authority depended in some way on his performance, that legitimacy was not merely a matter of bloodline and anointment, but also of governance. The negotiation at Normandy in the spring of 1014 was a small step, easily overlooked, toward the much larger idea that would eventually produce Magna Carta and Parliament and constitutional monarchy. It was an early articulation of the principle that kings owe something to their subjects, not just the other way around. Ethelred accepted the conditions. He had little choice. Exile in Normandy for the rest of his life was preferable to death but not to restoration, and these were his only options. So he promised to govern better. He promised to forgive those who had submitted to the Danes. He promised, in effect, to be a king worth following. Whether he believed his own promises, whether he intended to keep them, is impossible to know. The chroniclers do not record his private thoughts, only his public commitments. In the spring of 1014, Ethelred returned to England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle marks this as happening before Easter, which means early April at the latest. He came with a fleet, presumably ships provided by his Norman brother-in-law, and he came with his sons, including the prince, who would later be known as Edmund Ironside. He came to reclaim his kingdom. The landing was probably in the south, possibly at Southampton or one of the other harbors that had long served as entry points for traffic from the continent. The details are sparse. What matters is what happened next. The rapid reconstitution of royal authority in the regions where Danish control had been weakest. Wessex rallied to Ethelred almost immediately. This was the heartland of the English kingdom, the territory that had been most resistant to Danish rule even at the height of Sweyn's conquest. The nobility of Wessex had submitted because they had no alternative, but their submission had been tactical rather than ideological. They had not embraced Danish rule, they had tolerated it. Now that the conqueror was dead and the legitimate king had returned, their choice was easy. They returned to their allegiance with something that the sources suggest was genuine enthusiasm, or at least genuine relief. Mercia followed, though perhaps more slowly. The Mercian nobility had its own calculations to make, its own relationships with the Danish forces to consider. But Mercia too came back to Ethelred. The church, which had particular reasons to prefer a Christian English king to a recently Christian Danish one, provided institutional support. The network of royal administration, the sheriffs and reeves and local officials who actually made government function, began operating again in the name of Ethelred rather than Sweyn. This restoration happened with remarkable speed. Within weeks of Ethelred's return, he controlled most of England south of the Humber. The kingdom that Sweyn had spent 4 months conquering had reverted to its previous owner in a fraction of that time. It was as if the conquest had been written in water, impressive while it lasted, but fundamentally impermanent. And yet the conquest was not entirely reversed. The north remained Danish. The Danelaw, which had submitted to Sweyn so readily, did not revert to Ethelred with similar ease. The population there still saw Danish rule as natural rather than foreign, and Cnut's army was still at Gainsborough, still intact, still capable of fighting. The partition that had seemed so complete in December, Sweyn controlling everything, Ethelred controlling nothing, had become more complex. Now each side held territory. Now there would have to be a reckoning. Ethelred's approach to this reckoning reveals something important about his character, or perhaps about the advice he was receiving. He did not negotiate with Cnut. He did not offer a settlement that would have given the Danes some portion of England in exchange for peace. Instead, he marched north at the head of an army, determined to complete what Sweyn's death had begun, the expulsion of the Danes from English soil. The campaign of 1014 is poorly documented compared to Sweyn's invasion. The sources give us outcomes without details, results without narratives. What we know is this: Ethelred's army moved into Lincolnshire. Cnut's position at Gainsborough became untenable. The young Danish prince, the man who would one day rule an empire stretching from England to Scandinavia, found himself facing a choice between fighting a battle he would probably lose and retreating while he still could. He chose retreat. The Danish fleet sailed from the Trent out into the Humber and then north along the coast. The army that had conquered England under Sweyn Forkbeard was leaving England under his son. The conquest that had seemed so complete, so final, so thoroughly executed, was unraveling. But Cnut did something before he left that would be remembered for generations, something that revealed both his ruthlessness and his political sophistication. He had hostages. Remember the hostages, the sons of English nobles who had submitted to Sweyn, the human guarantees of their father's loyalty. These hostages were still in Danish hands when the retreat began. A sentimental commander might have released them or used them as bargaining chips for a negotiated settlement, or brought them to Denmark as potential tools for future diplomacy. Cnut did none of these things. He had the hostages mutilated, their hands and ears and noses cut off, and then put them ashore at Sandwich before sailing for Denmark. The sources record this atrocity without extensive comment, as if it were a normal part of medieval warfare, which in some ways it was. But the mutilation of the hostages was also a message, delivered in flesh and blood and bone. It said, "I have not forgotten." It said, "I have not forgiven." It said, "I will be back." The mutilated sons of English nobles, walking or being carried to their fathers' estates, were living advertisements of Danish vengeance. They were reminders that the conflict was not over, that the submission of 1013 had been recorded in Danish memories, that those who had submitted to Sweyn and then returned to Ethelred had made themselves enemies. They were, in short, a promise of future war. Cnut sailed to Denmark in the summer of 1014. He was perhaps 20 years old, perhaps younger. He had participated in one of the most successful conquests in English history, and then watched that conquest dissolve in a matter of weeks. He had learned, in the hardest possible way, that taking a kingdom and keeping a kingdom are different problems. He had learned that luck is distributed unevenly, that a dead father cannot be replaced, that an army's loyalty lasts only as long as victory seems likely. But he had also learned something else, something more useful for the future. He had learned that England could be conquered. He had seen how it was done. He had watched his father exploit English divisions, bypass English defenses, turn English subjects into Danish collaborators. He had seen the system work. The system had not failed. His father had died. These were different problems, and the second could be addressed in ways the first could not. Cnut would be back. This was not hope or desire, but calculation. England was too wealthy, too strategically important, too personally significant to abandon. The conquest of 1013 had been stolen from him by death and bad timing. He intended to steal it back. Meanwhile, Ethelred had recovered his kingdom. The king who had been driven into exile by a comprehensive military and political failure was once again ruling England, apparently vindicated by events. Sweyn was dead. Cnut had fled. The Danish fleet was gone from English waters. It was, on the surface, a remarkable reversal, a restoration against all odds, a second chance that few kings ever receive. But beneath the surface, the problems that had made the conquest possible remained. Ethelred was still Ethelred, the same man who had mismanaged the Viking raids for years, who had ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, who had failed to build the coalitions and command structures that might have stopped Sweyn in the first place. He had promised to govern better. Whether he was capable of governing better was a different question. The nobility who had returned to his side were the same nobility who had abandoned him, and they knew they had abandoned him, and he knew they knew. The mutual suspicion that had poisoned English politics for decades did not disappear because Sweyn died. If anything, the experience of the conquest had deepened it. Ethelred had seen his lords submit to a foreign invader with unseemly haste. The lords had seen their king flee to Normandy at the first serious pressure. Neither side had covered itself in glory. Neither side had much reason to trust the other going forward. And there were the mutilated hostages to consider. The sons of English nobles, disfigured by Danish blades, were constant reminders that the submission of 1013 had consequences. Their fathers had gambled on Danish victory and lost. Now they had returned to Ethelred's side, but Cnut knew who they were, knew what they had done, knew that their loyalty was for sale to whoever seemed likely to win. These men were not reliable supporters of the English crown. They were survivors, calculating their odds with every shift in the political wind. Ethelred's restoration was real but fragile. He had recovered his kingdom, but he had not solved the problems that had caused him to lose it. The Danish threat remained. The internal divisions remained. The structural weaknesses of English royal authority remained. All that had changed was that Sweyn was dead and Cnut was temporarily absent. And Ethelred himself was not young anymore. The sources do not give us his exact age, but he had been king since 978, 36 years by 1014. He had been a child when he inherited the throne, which means he was probably in his mid-40s by the time of his restoration. This was old by medieval standards, especially for a man who had spent decades under the accumulated stresses of Viking warfare, political conspiracy, and personal failure. His health may already have been declining. His energy, certainly, was not what it had been. The restored king had perhaps 2 years to live. He did not know this, of course. No one knows such things in advance. But time was working against Ethelred in ways that it was not working against Cnut. The old king was getting older. The young prince was getting more experienced. The balance that had temporarily shifted toward England would shift again. The shift came faster than anyone expected. Cnut spent the months after his departure from England preparing. He sailed first to Denmark, where his brother Harold had inherited their father's throne. The two sons of Sweyn Forkbeard faced a choice that would determine the future of both kingdoms, cooperation or rivalry. They chose cooperation. Harold provided ships, men, and resources for a renewed invasion of England. In return, Cnut seems to have acknowledged his brother's primacy in Denmark itself, at least for the moment. The arrangement was pragmatic rather than warm. Both brothers understood that England was the greater prize, and that taking it would require concentration of force rather than division. But Cnut did not simply gather ships, he gathered allies. He traveled to the court of Thorkel the Tall, the legendary Viking commander who had served Ethelred since 1012. Thorkel had been one of the most effective warriors on the English side during Sweyn's invasion, his professional soldiers providing expertise that the English levies lacked. Now, in the fluid aftermath of Sweyn's death, Thorkel changed sides. The sources do not tell us exactly why. Perhaps Ethelred had failed to pay him adequately. Perhaps the aging Viking saw which way the wind was blowing and preferred to be on the winning side when it finished blowing. Perhaps he simply preferred the company of fellow Scandinavians to the fractious court of a king he had never fully trusted. Whatever his reasons, Thorkel's defection was a strategic disaster for England. He brought with him not just his reputation, but his knowledge, intimate familiarity with English coastal defenses, English military capabilities, English political fault lines. He knew which lords could be bought, which could be frightened, which would fight to the death. He knew the harbors and the rivers and the roads. He had spent years defending England, and now he would spend years attacking it, and the information he carried in his head was worth more than a dozen ships. Cnut also reached out to his brother-in-law, Eric of Lade, a Norwegian jarl with a formidable military record. Eric had helped Sweyn conquer Norway years earlier, and now commanded respect throughout Scandinavia as a warrior and administrator. He too agreed to join the invasion. The fleet that Cnut was assembling was not just large, it was experienced. These were not raiders hoping for plunder, but professional military men seeking permanent conquest. They had seen how close Sweyn had come, and they intended to finish what he had started. The invasion force that gathered in the summer of 1015 was enormous by any standard. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it as one of the largest fleets ever to threaten England. Modern estimates vary, but the numbers were certainly sufficient to overwhelm any defense Ethelred could mount. Ships from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Slavic lands of the southern Baltic carried warriors who expected victory. They had seen England submit once. They expected it to submit again. But England in 1015 was not quite the England of 1013. Ethelred, for all his failures, had not been entirely passive during his restoration. He had attempted to rebuild his military forces, to secure the loyalty of his nobles, to prepare for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. And he had one asset that he had not possessed during Sweyn's campaign: his son Edmund. Edmund Ironside, the epithet itself tells you something about his reputation, was everything his father was not. Young, vigorous, personally brave, and genuinely talented as a military commander, Edmund represented the possibility of effective English resistance in a way that Ethelred never had. He had spent his father's restoration building his own power base, cultivating relationships with the nobility of the Danelaw, and preparing for the confrontation that he knew was inevitable. When Cnut's fleet appeared off the English coast in late summer 1015, Edmund was ready to fight in ways his father had never been. The campaign that followed was the bloodiest and most evenly matched contest for England since the time of Alfred the Great. Unlike Sweyn's conquest, which had been a systematic reduction of English resistance through overwhelming force and political manipulation, Cnut's conquest was a genuine war. Edmund refused to submit. He raised armies, fought battles, won victories, lost victories, and kept fighting. The young prince, who had been a child during his father's worst failures, was now the primary obstacle to Danish domination. Cnut landed in the south, probably in Kent, and immediately began the process his father had pioneered: submission, hostage-taking, provisioning. But this time, the submissions were less comprehensive. Some lords held back. Some calculated that Edmund might yet prevail. The certainty that had characterized Sweyn's campaign, the sense that resistance was futile, was absent. Cnut was not his father. He had not yet proven himself. He was a young man with a famous name and a large army, but famous names and large armies had failed in England before. The first months of the campaign established a pattern that would continue through 1016. Cnut would advance, seizing territory and extracting submissions. Edmund would counterattack, rallying resistance and recapturing ground. Neither side could achieve the decisive advantage that would end the war. The Danish fleet gave Cnut mobility. He could strike anywhere along the coast, retreat when threatened, reappear unexpectedly. But Edmund's knowledge of the interior and his ability to inspire English resistance made sustained occupation difficult. The war became a grinding contest of endurance, resources, and will. Then, in April 1016, Ethelred died. The king, who had been defined by failure, who had lost his kingdom to Sweyn Forkbeard and recovered it only through the accident of Sweyn's death, was finally released from the burden of his crown. He died in London, which was still holding out against the Danes, still refusing to submit to the conquest that had swallowed the rest of the kingdom. The timing was not coincidental. The stress of the invasion, the knowledge that everything was slipping away again, the accumulated weight of nearly 4 decades of crisis, these things killed Ethelred as surely as any disease. He was perhaps 48 years old, though the sources are not precise. He had been king since childhood. He had never been equal to his kingship, and he knew it, and everyone knew it, and now he was dead. The nobility who remained in London, the stubborn remnant who had not yet submitted to Cnut, immediately elected Edmund as king. It was a coronation of desperation, conducted in a city under siege by men who had no other options. But it was legitimate according to the customs of the time, and it gave Edmund something his father had never truly possessed: the clarity of purpose that comes from being chosen rather than inherited. Edmund Ironside was now king of what remained of England. What remained was not much: London, parts of the southwest, scattered resistance elsewhere. But it was enough to fight with, and Edmund intended to fight. The War of 1016 was ferocious: 5 major battles in a single year, each one contested with a savagery that the sources struggle to describe adequately. Edmund won at least 2 of them convincingly. He lost others. The kingdom swung back and forth between the 2 claimants like a pendulum that could not find its rest. Cnut had the ships, the money, the professional soldiers, and the experience of conquest. Edmund had the legitimacy, the local knowledge, the personal courage, and the desperate energy of a man fighting for everything he had. At the Battle of Ashington in October 1016, the pendulum stopped. The armies met in Essex, somewhere in the Low Country near the coast, and fought the bloodiest battle England had seen in generations. The sources describe it as a disaster for the English. All the nobility of England was there destroyed, says the chronicle with characteristic understatement. Edmund's army was shattered. His best commanders were killed. The resistance that had seemed so promising just months earlier was broken in a single afternoon of slaughter. But Edmund himself survived. He retreated westward, gathering what forces he could, preparing to fight again. Cnut pursued but did not catch him, and then, surprisingly, the 2 kings talked. The Treaty of Alney, negotiated in the autumn of 1016, divided England between them. Edmund would rule Wessex, the ancient heartland of the English kingdom. Cnut would rule everything else: Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, the rich lands of the Danelaw. The 2 kings would coexist, at least for now. When one of them died, the other would inherit the whole kingdom. It was a pragmatic arrangement, born of mutual exhaustion and mutual respect. Edmund had proven that he could not be easily defeated. Cnut had proven that he could not be driven away. Neither had the strength to destroy the other quickly, and a prolonged war would devastate the kingdom both wanted to rule. Division was a compromise, a pause, a way of letting time and mortality settle what the sword could not. Time and mortality settled it almost immediately. On November 30th, 1016, less than 2 months after Ashington, barely a month after the treaty, Edmund Ironside died. He was perhaps in his mid-20s. The sources do not agree on the cause. Some say disease. Some say wounds from battle that never properly healed. Some hint at assassination at the hand of a traitor who saw advantage in Edmund's death. The truth is unknowable, lost in the chaos of a kingdom that had been at war for years and had no energy left for careful record-keeping. What matters is that Edmund was dead, and Cnut was not, and the treaty they had signed gave the survivor everything. Cnut inherited England, not conquered it, inherited it. The word matters. By the terms of the treaty, by the customs of the kingdom, by every standard that contemporaries would have recognized, Cnut's succession was legitimate. Edmund had agreed to the division. Edmund had agreed that the survivor would rule the whole. Edmund had died. Therefore, Cnut was king of all England, not by conquest but by law, not by the sword but by the fatal accident of a young man's unexpectedly early death. The son of Sweyn Forkbeard, who had fled England in humiliation less than 3 years earlier, was now the undisputed ruler of one of the wealthiest kingdoms in northern Europe. He was perhaps 20 years old. The victory was complete, more complete in some ways than Sweyn's had been. Sweyn had conquered England, but died before consolidating his rule. Cnut had conquered England and then received legal title to it through a treaty that made his rule unchallengeable. There were no rival claimants with legitimate standing. Edmund's young sons were children, too young to fight, and Cnut moved quickly to neutralize them. Some sources say he sent them abroad, to Hungary, where they could cause no trouble. Ethelred's older sons from his first marriage were in Normandy with their mother's people, equally irrelevant. The House of Wessex, the dynasty that had ruled England for centuries, was effectively extinct as a political force. Cnut had achieved what his father only glimpsed. He had taken England, held England, and would rule England for nearly 2 decades. His reign was, by most accounts, a good one. He was remembered as a just king, a generous patron of the church, a ruler who respected English customs and worked to integrate Danes and English into a single political community. The famous story of Cnut and the waves, the king who commanded the tide to stop to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that even kings cannot overcome nature, comes from this period. Whether it happened or not, it captures something true about his reputation, a king who understood the limits of power and governed accordingly. But here's what history does not often say, what gets lost in the triumphant narrative of Cnut's reign. None of this would have happened without Sweyn. Sweyn conquered England. Sweyn broke the back of English resistance. Sweyn forced the submissions, took the hostages, demonstrated that the kingdom could be taken. Every advantage Cnut possessed in 1015, the knowledge, the connections, the demoralized English nobility, the pattern of success that made further success imaginable, came from Sweyn's campaign. Cnut inherited not just ships and soldiers, but the entire strategic situation his father had created. When historians write about the Danish conquest of England, they write about Cnut. When popular culture remembers the Viking kings who ruled Britain, it remembers Cnut. The name that echoes through 1,000 years is Cnut, not Sweyn. The reputation that survives is Cnut, not Sweyn. The king who demonstrated the limits of royal power with his performance at the seashore is Cnut. The king who actually conquered England, the king who did the impossible thing that had never been done before and has never been done since, is barely a footnote. This is not conspiracy or deliberate suppression. It is simply the way memory works. Sweyn died before the story was finished. He did not get to consolidate, to build, to become the kind of long-reigning king whose deeds accumulate into legend. He got 40 days. 40 days is not enough time to become memorable. It is barely enough time to become real. Cnut ruled England for 19 years. He ruled Denmark for nearly 2 decades. He ruled Norway for a time. He built an empire, the so-called North Sea Empire, that stretched from the Baltic to the Irish Sea, encompassing some of the most important territories in northern Europe. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, in a stroke of political genius that linked his dynasty to both the Old English royal house and the rising power of the Norman dukes. He corresponded with popes and emperors. He went on pilgrimage to Rome. He died peacefully in his own bed at the height of his power. All of this makes for a better story than Sweyn's. A young prince overcoming early setbacks to achieve greatness, ruling wisely for decades, building something that lasted. This is the shape of a hero's tale. Sweyn's story has no such shape. It is the story of a lifelong struggle against formidable odds, a late-life triumph achieved through decades of persistence, and then sudden meaningless death before the triumph could be enjoyed. This is not the shape of a hero's tale. It is the shape of a tragedy, or perhaps a joke, depending on how you look at it. And so Cnut gets the credit. Cnut gets the memory. Cnut gets to be the king who conquered England, even though by the time Cnut took the crown, England had already been conquered once and reconquered only through the contingent mercy of Sweyn's heart. The conquest of 1013 was Sweyn's conquest. The kingdom that Cnut inherited was Sweyn's kingdom. The pattern of Danish rule over England, the integration, the respect for local customs, the balance between English and Danish elites, was established in those 40 days when Sweyn sat at Gainsborough receiving submissions. Everything that came after was built on the foundation Sweyn laid, even if Sweyn did not live to see the building. William the Conqueror, who took England 50 years later, is remembered as the great conqueror of English history. His face appears in endless documentaries. His invasion is taught in every school. The Battle of Hastings is one of the most famous events in British history. But William's conquest was, by almost any measure, less impressive than Sweyn's. William fought a single battle against an exhausted English army that had just marched the length of the kingdom to defeat a different invasion. He won that battle largely through luck. Harold's death was an accident, an arrow that could just as easily have missed. And William's conquest was extraordinarily violent. The harrying of the North, in which William systematically destroyed the northern counties to suppress resistance, killed tens of thousands and left scars that lasted generations. Sweyn did none of this. Sweyn conquered England through a campaign of such strategic brilliance that the kingdom simply submitted. He fought battles when he had to, but mostly he didn't have to. He moved from strength to strength, from submission to submission, until the king fled and the resistance collapsed and the thing was done. The most complete military conquest in English history, achieved with the least bloodshed, executed with the greatest economy of force. And then he died. And his son got the credit, and his conquest became a prologue to someone else's story. The sources do not tell us where Sweyn Forkbeard is buried. The most likely location is Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark, where many Danish kings of the medieval period were interred. But there is no tomb, no monument, no marker that says, "Here lies the king who conquered England." He exists in the historical record as a shadow, a transitional figure, a man who did something extraordinary and then vanished before the extraordinary thing could become his. His body, if it is in Roskilde, lies beneath stone that does not remember him. The cathedral that stands there now was built after his time, rebuilt and expanded across the centuries until it became the grand monument it is today. Whatever remained of Sweyn was absorbed into the fabric of the building, or lost in one of the reconstructions, or simply forgotten. The location is probable. The certainty is absent. This is fitting, in a way that the writer cannot help but notice. The king who accomplished one of the most remarkable military feats in medieval history is commemorated by uncertainty. Here he might be. Here he probably is. Here, beneath these stones that have been moved and rebuilt and rearranged across 1,000 years, lies what remains of the man who took England. The wind off the Baltic still blows through Roskilde. The cathedral still stands. The tourists who visit, if they think of Sweyn at all, think of him as Cnut's father, as the prelude to the king they actually came to learn about. The ships that sailed 1,000 years ago are scattered atoms now. The men who sailed them are forgotten. The women they left behind are forgotten. The whole vast enterprise of the Viking Age, the raids, the conquests, the settlements, the kingdoms built and lost and built again, has become a story we tell ourselves about people who are not quite real to us anymore. But they were real. Sweyn was real. He stood on the deck of a ship in the English Channel and saw the coast of a kingdom he intended to take. He calculated the odds, measured the forces, read the political weaknesses of a divided land, and acted on what he saw. He spent his life building the tools he would need for this one purpose, and when the time came, he used them with a precision that borders on the uncanny. He was not lucky. He was not favored by fate. He was competent in the deepest sense of the word, a man who understood his world and operated effectively within its constraints. And then his heart stopped, and the world moved on, and his son took the credit. And that is the way of things. The conquest of England in 1013 was the most complete military and political victory in English history. It was achieved by a man whose name most people do not know, whose face no portraits preserve, whose tomb no pilgrim visits. He ruled his conquered kingdom for 40 days. He died before the celebration, before the consolidation, before the history books could decide what he meant. History decided he meant Cnut. History decided he was a prelude, a setup, a transitional figure connecting the chaos of Ethelred's reign to the glory of his sons. History decided that the man who actually did the thing mattered less than the man who inherited it. History was wrong. History is often wrong. History is written by survivors, and Sweyn did not survive. But the conquest was his. The victory was his. The 40 days were his. The 1,000 years that forgot him were everyone else's. Somewhere in Roskilde, beneath stone that has been laid and relaid across 10 centuries, the conqueror of England is still waiting for someone to remember what he did. The wind off the Baltic does not care. The stone does not care. The sea that carried his ships has no memory. Only the record remains, fragmentary, incomplete, overshadowed by the son who outlived him. Only the fact remains. He took England, and then England took everything back except the taking. That is still his. It always was.